Today's reading is from John's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 19 to 23. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Priya.
Daddy,
Yes?
knock knock.
Who's there?
Warren.
Warren who?
War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy.
Highbrow. Right, for this bit of the service, you are going to need the bit of paper that I asked you to get earlier. So, can I suggest that you hold it landscape? And then the first thing you're going to want to do is to find a little mark, make a little mark in the middle. You can do this by just folding it over and finding where the centre is, but don't fold it completely in half. Because then what I want you to do is to fold over the sides in like that and in like that. And then hopefully you'll end up with something a bit like this. You see, the passage that Priya read to us takes place on that very first Easter Sunday evening. Jesus had died and risen again, but the disciples didn't know that yet, or at least weren't sure. And we're told that they were hiding behind closed doors. Now, we're stuck behind closed doors at the moment as well, aren't we? Not in exactly the same way that the disciples were. But perhaps we might be experiencing some of the same emotions that they were going through. They were frightened. They were frightened for their lives because of the Jewish authorities. Maybe we're frightened because of the coronavirus. They were grieving the loss of their friend and leader. Some of us are grieving too. They were experiencing loss. They'd given their whole lives to this project and now it was in tatters. Some of us maybe are experiencing loss too. Loss of job or income or purpose. And they were confused. They were confused because they'd heard these stories of an empty tomb and they didn't know what to make of it. Maybe we're confused too. We'll be going through all sorts of emotions. And so what I'd like you to do is on your piece of paper on the outside of these doors, maybe write down some emotions that you're feeling. It could be grief or loss. It could be boredom or frustration. It could be any number of different things. But anything that you're feeling because of this particular situation that we find ourselves in. So they were hiding behind closed doors, feeling all these emotions. As I imagine them there, I imagine John sitting in the corner with his head in his hands. I imagine Peter pacing up and down with nervous energy. I imagine Bartholomew leaning back against a wall, staring blankly into space. And then suddenly, miraculously, Jesus was there amongst them. It was really him. And everything changed. The first thing that Jesus said to them was, "Peace be with you." Now that was just a normal Jewish greeting, a bit like saying hello. But in this instance, it meant so much more. Because one of the last things that he'd said to them before he died, which we have recorded in John 14:27, was, "Peace I give you, my peace I leave with you." So you see, just before they entered the darkest period of their lives, Jesus gave them his peace. And then, as he came to them again and was bringing them out of that darkest period of their lives, he gave them his peace. You see, the wonderful thing about following Jesus is that even in the midst of a crisis, we can know his peace if we open ourselves to him. So would you open your doors? And then I'd like you just along the top here, because we're going to write three things. If you write peace along the top there. So Jesus gave them his peace. The next thing he gave them was his presence. You see, he was really there with them. He showed them his hands and his side. It was really him. Now, we can't experience Jesus' presence in the same way that they did. But the amazing news is that through his Holy Spirit, that is God who lives within us, we can experience his presence with us now. In fact, it was there in that room that God gave them the Holy Spirit. It says that he breathed on them. I don't really know how I feel about that. I don't much like being breathed on. But we do know that Jesus didn't have bad breath. Firstly, because he was God, and secondly, because we know the kinds of toothpaste that he used. Things like Alpha Fresh and Colgates of Heaven, maybe Pastoral Bee, Sensor Divine. Sorry. Anyway, the point is that the breath thing is important because one of the words for spirit is ruach, which means breath. You see, sometimes God speaks to us in a gentle whisper, and sometimes in a mighty rushing wind, but his presence is always with us. So, perhaps you could write presence underneath where you've written peace. So Jesus gave them his peace and his presence. And then finally, he gave them a purpose. He sent them out. And then he said this rather strange thing. He said, if you forgive others, then they will be forgiven. And if you don't, they won't. Now, what on earth does he mean by that? Because we know that it's only God who can forgive sins, so he's not really talking about that. Well, theologians have been arguing about this for millennia, and we're not going to solve the problem now. One possibility is that it might be better translated as, if you set people free, then they will be free indeed. And if you don't set people free, then they won't. So perhaps Jesus is sending his disciples and us out to help others to find the freedom that is in the life that God is calling them to. Jesus did say to the disciples, as my Father sent me, so I am sending you. How did God send Jesus? In love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. So Jesus sends us in love to go out to help to set others free, that they might live the kind of life that God is calling them to. That sounds like a good purpose to me. So, you can write on the bottom of the inside here, purpose. So, we are in a time of crisis, and we're experiencing all sorts of difficult emotions. And it's easy to stay shut up behind our closed doors. But actually, if we open ourselves to Jesus, we can experience something of his peace and presence and purpose. It doesn't mean that those other things just go away. Look, you can still probably see bits of it here. But it does mean perhaps that they get put in their right context and that we can experience the light and life of Jesus. So I wonder, what does living in the peace, presence and purpose feel like to you this week?